I've been talking you through my story this whole time where I understood that I didn't have a good definition of gratitude. And I started to notice that when I understood it, it changed my posture, it changed my breathing. And then I was able to link back in all these other psychological, physiological, and emotional things that I had learned over the years to start to induce greater and greater openness in my chest and really feeling this huge emotion of gratitude. And getting personal, at this point in my life, I had gone through quite a bit. I'd had a very complicated couple of years with relationships, with injuries, and with understanding my life and retirement. And I was feeling this enormous sense of gratitude, and it was so big that I thought I'm maxed out on gratitude. And for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like just experiencing love was that far of a jump. And this is what climbing the emotional scale is all about. It's about the idea that gratitude is a concept that when we apply it as what is the lesson, what is the gift, it helps us climb different levels of the emotional scale. And the more that we can visit and live in more frequently higher level emotions and access them, the more frequently that we can move better, that we can think better, that we can think more clearly, and we can access our highest level of physical potential. Now, at this point, so I'll keep going through, I'll keep telling the story. This is where we get into it. So first of all, I like to say that the emotional scale is organized from high to low, and it goes from this idea of despair, if you look all the way at the bottom, fear, grief, powerlessness, to going all the way at the top, and you see joy, appreciation, empowerment, freedom, love. And obviously those are at very different ends of the scale. And just above my lovely little toolbar here, you'll see boredom, which one could say is the neutral zone or the middle. And what I really realized in this moment when I was feeling this enormous amount of gratitude was that emotions are a continuum. They're not a ladder with categories. We don't just jump emotions. We kind of blend into one and another, and we very rarely experience one emotion. We're often experiencing some kind of cocktail. And when we practice emotions cognitively, we put them into categories because that's how our brain often makes sense of things. But emotions allow us, or emotional experiencing of an emotion is a more fluid spectrum. It allows us to move up and down and through the spectrum and allow us to not get so trapped when we understand that we can move through these feelings quite quickly, quite fluidly, and under a fair amount of control. So gratitude is your emotional springboard. And I remember this quote people just say, just be love. And you'll hear all these spiritual gurus say this, and it can sound kind of like BS. And you think, well, I feel horrible. How could it just make me experience love all the time? And it feels ridiculous. But this is what gratitude is so interesting for, is that it is the most accessible positive emotion because it requires you only understanding or seeing the gift of something outside of you that has nothing to do with you. And when we're feeling down, when we're in blame or doubt or worry or anger, we don't actually have to feel grateful. We can simply start thinking about things that we are grateful for, that they exist, and it helps us climb up the rungs. So, for example, if I was feeling incredible discouragement after an injury or after a meet, I would think, well, I'm so bummed out. This really sucks. And if I were to use gratitude right now, I'd say, well, at least I'm really in my body, and I've learned a lesson about how to move differently and a lesson about how to not to be injured like this again. And I still don't feel good. I don't feel literally grateful. But then I start to think about, okay, well, who do I blame? Or am I worried about injuring myself in the future? How does this affect other things of my future? How does this affect my next meet? And you notice I've now taken myself out of discouragement and into doubt and worry, which is actually higher up on the scale. So it's not about transcending yourself to enthusiasm in moments where you feel genuinely in a low level emotion. It's about using gratitude to help lift you up as appropriate for that time so that you don't wallow in places and live places that don't serve you. It helps you find the solution. And gratitude is also very useful in this moment where I'm experiencing this enormous amount of gratitude and joy and positivity, where it acts as a gateway to higher states like love, peace, and transcendence. And I remember this moment, I'm in the woods and I'm feeling all this gratitude, and I think, it's been a long time, but I've been in love before and I remember what that felt like. And I hadn't let myself feel it in years. And all of a sudden, I just remembered past stories, remembered things that had happened to me, and I allowed myself to actually feel in love. But I felt it all by myself in a room, in a cabin, in the woods. And it was this deep moment of knowing that I didn't have to rely on an external source to feel that way. I could generate it within myself. Others can trigger it within us, but it is always within us. And I don't live there all the time, but it was this moment of huge amount of dopamine release, huge amount of endorphins. And this was a moment where I experienced this opening of my mind. And all the thoughts that I'd been thinking about high performance, about everything I'd been thinking about all the things that had impacted my performance all over the years, was like my brain lit up, like broaden and build theory. And it just went ding, 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 ding. And I connected all these dots in an instant. It was one of the most surreal moments of my life. And that's when I knew I needed to come back for another Olympics, because I'd figured something out. So on to the next slide, and I'll tell you exactly what that is. But I like to say gratitude is like an emotional Sherpa. It can help us go up. It can help us go one step at a time, and it can get us all the way to the top. But we know it's always there for us to take us through these different emotions, to help us figure out what negative emotions are telling us, so we can figure out what we actually want. So emotions are, the thing that I figured out was that your emotional state completely changes your posture, and it completely changes your mobility and your strength. So this is a pose from Ashtanga Yoga. And when I had initially retired, all I did was learn a little bit of dancing and do Ashtanga Yoga for 4 months straight. And I had been trying to do this pose for 4 months. I could put my foot into my hip and I could reach my arm behind my back, but I couldn't touch my foot. I was about 3 to 4 inches away from it. And after having this huge moment, experiencing this enormous amount of love, I noticed how open my chest was. And I put myself into this pose and I thought about gratitude, tongue posture, gratitude, let my shoulders open up, gratitude, breathe properly, gratitude, like back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, gratitude, broaden and build theory, and gratitude, let myself smile. And my arm just snaked behind my back and I palmed my entire foot. And I thought, if I get an extra 6 inches of mobility in my shoulder from 5 minutes of experiencing gratitude, what would that do to a javelin throw? If I just got 6 inches of mobility when I've been struggling to get this pose for 4 months, and then all of a sudden it went. This isn't a structural issue, and this isn't a flexibility issue. This isn't a genetic issue. This is an emotional issue. And emotions affect the way we move. Happy people walk differently than sad people. So moving into how this actually works on a physiological scale, this is something that is becoming quite a bit more popular and quite a bit more prevalent in sport, where people are starting to look at the idea, or people are starting to think more broadly about the idea that it is not just muscles that make strength, it is coordination patterns. And coordination patterns isn't just in our nervous system, it is also in our fascial system. And fascia is a connective network across the body. And it is said that emotions are stored in fascia. And this is why different people walk differently when they're happy versus when they're sad. This is why people get neck injuries, or they get injuries when they are emotionally overcome. I actually used to have something that my physio and I would refer to as boyfriend neck, because when I'd get really stressed out with a guy I was dating, I wouldn't be able to look left because I'd get a complete lockup in a part of my neck. So when we release these fascial lines, and we can release them manually with physiotherapists, but we can also release them emotionally, that's when we get whole new ranges of motion. So there's going to be links in this section down below to a really great Instagram page that does a really good job of explaining quite a bit of this. And you could spend years researching this, but simply understanding that fascia is linked to emotion, emotions change the way we move, and that it's not a small amount of change of movement, it's a very significant change. Not just, again, in mobility, but in coordination patterns, because happy people walk differently than sad people. So before we move on to the induction, which is the exercise in the very next module, I just wanted to quickly review everything that we've gone through so far. So we reviewed deeper definitions and types of gratitude. So gratitude is a feeling of receiving a gift, something we don't deserve, something that's not owed to us, something that we think, really? For me? Great. And if we play this game that every experience is a gift, even if it's disguised as a tough lesson, then we overcome these challenges faster and with way more grace, way more ease, because life is about learning lessons and about growing. Then we went into the emotional overview, the idea that there is an emotional scale. There is a purpose to low-level emotions. They're teaching us what we don't want so that we can figure out what we do want, which is a higher consciousness process that is in our prefrontal cortex. Then we talked about broad and built theory, the idea that high-level emotions allow us to think more creatively, into the idea that emotions are a lens over thoughts. They color the way we interpret reality, and they can either blind us to certain aspects of a reality, or they can make them more available to us if we are paying attention with a different emotional lens. Then we talked about visiting versus living in an emotion and started to identify, where do I live at practice? Where do I live at training? Where am I often visiting that stops me from living in a higher level state? And really starting to look at, am I allowing myself to be more creative, better at problem solving, and now better at moving? Then I love to say frustration indicates an opportunity. That's one of my favorite takeaways, is that every single time I started to get frustrated, I would notice that this was something that was important to me. And it was probably a very exciting moment, because if I figured out that thing, that's where the next huge level up would come. Emotions are telling us something important, even if they're challenging. Then last, we went and we looped back in the physiology. We talked about cognitive versus emotional gratitude, and how sometimes if we don't actually pause and wait, we don't understand something emotionally, we don't bask in it, and it doesn't create the physiological shift of response to emotions, which is the point of a gratitude practice. Then we went over facial feedback hypothesis, power poses, and acting, indicating how if we blunt any part of these physiological feedback mechanisms, these physical feedback mechanisms, if we stop ourselves from smiling, we will feel less happy. If we are hunched over, the posture does not help our face doesn't help our posture, and this is a big feedback loop. And then the idea, again, of acting. Actors understand emotions, they understand their character, they understand their drive and their motivation, and it helps them embody it. And actors can look like completely different people and move like different people because of their understanding of emotion. But we don't have to be actors, we just have to understand gratitude as the Pareto's law. Then last, we talked about the heart-brain connection. The reminder that there is more physiology here than we realize, and we forget this, that there are neurons in our heart, and that there is information in our heart, and there's neurons in our gut. They're known as mini brains, and they influence the brain as much as the brain influences them. And this is just a big feedback loop. So when we tap into this, when we think more and more about these different parts, these different interacting factors, we start to understand how if we just tap into emotions, everything else that we're already doing gets amplified. Training becomes more fun, you move better, you think more creatively. So, on to the induction.